Hello, I'm John Humphreys. I'm the Executive Director for the Wisconsin Association for Equity and Funding, and I'm pleased to share with you today some background and next steps with regard to revenue limits in the state of Wisconsin. Revenue limits have a very different effect on kids in low revenues districts than they do in high revenue districts. We want to share a little bit about that with you and some next steps. I'm going to jump right in here and share my screen with you, and we can get started. So we'll be talking about the revenue limits and what their impact is on students, and then some recent proposals from the DPI, the governor, and AEF. A revenue limit, very simply, is the amount of money a school district can raise to educate each student. Some revenues fall outside of revenue limits, typically about a quarter to a third. But while school finance is complicated, revenue limits are not complicated at all. The funding comes from two sources, from the state and local taxes, and that those proportions of those amounts differ based on the property wealth in the district. The revenue limits were put into place about 30 years ago. They set the revenue caps at the level that the school districts were spending in the prior year, and no one knew it was coming. Some districts had big projects going on and were spending freely, and others were being fiscally conservative. No matter, those differences were baked in, and they have never recovered. At that time, the average state spending varied by over 50%. So there were some really major differences in existence at that time. There was no logic or rationale. In fact, the governor at the signing ceremony in 1993, Governor Thompson said, "I can assure you we'll look at the equity question and come forward with a plan for the next biennial budget." Well, these revenue limits have been in place for 30 years. This is what they looked like 30 years ago. And in 30 seconds, I'm going to show you the revenue limit every year over the past 30 years. What this graph shows is that this is the height of the bar is the number of districts that had the revenue limit at that dollar amount. So you can see there were some districts way at the low end and some districts way at the high end of that chart. So I'm going to switch screens here and show you in 30 seconds what revenue limits look like every year since 1993. You can see there's a wide distribution. They're starting to cluster more in one area, but there's still a substantial distribution. And now we're getting close to today. And there we are, current year, 2021, 2022. This is what revenue limits look like in the current state system. You can see 125 school districts in red, stuck at $10,000 per pupil. There are another 125 school districts that get more than $11,000 per pupil. It's not connected to anything rational or logical. It's what the district was spending 30 years ago. And you can see in some areas there are a couple of blue districts and quite a few districts in red spread all over the state. Here's an example from Waukesha, suburban Milwaukee. Their total funding is split 74% under the revenue cap, 26% not under the revenue cap. Of that 74%, that's $10,000 and $10,204 per student. 31% of that amount comes from state aid. 43% of the total comes from local property taxes. In that year, when Waukesha was getting $10,204 per student, Elmbrook, just next door, was getting $12,207 per student. Why does Elmbrook get 20% more dollars per student than Waukesha? They're not that different. In fact, one could argue that the needs of students in Waukesha might even be greater than the needs of students in Elmbrook. Nevertheless, there's substantial discrepancies. You can see Muskego, Norway and New Berlin, both at New Berlin substantially higher than the other two as well. The low revenue districts, if they were funded at the state average, would have substantially higher revenues. Muskego, Norway would have gotten $4.5 million more, and Waukesha would have gotten $7.2 million more. In fact, over the 30 years, if Waukesha could have been gaining revenue at the state average level, they would have been able to have $27 million more to educate their students. In 3 decades, millions and millions of state tax dollars were funneled to lavishly fund education in other districts when Waukesha students were stuck at the bottom. No wonder they passed a $60 million referendum in 2018. They wanted to keep up with other districts around them. Their local property taxes payers were making up for the lack of fairness in our state revenue system. So let's talk about the impact of revenue limits. Are they persistent? How do they correlate with family income? And what about class sizes, staffing, and spending? AEF contracted with a professor of public policy, Jesse Rothstein from the University of California, to examine these questions. First of all, revenue limits are persistent. You can see that a district that was at a low revenue limit in 1994 typically was not able to get to a high revenue limit number in 2019. Revenue limits are correlated with average household income, more at the larger district level. And revenue limits are correlated very strongly with expenditures. Obviously, if you don't have the money, you can't spend it. So you see a very strong correlation of expenditures per pupil and revenue limits. Now, this chart is very complicated. There's a lot of data there, but what it shows is that revenue limits are not strongly correlated with student test scores on the state forward exam. And I'm going to call out this 3rd grade reading test. What you see here is actually a negative correlation, that the more the district spends or the more the district has in revenue limit, the lower is their student achievement on the forward exam. It doesn't make any sense, but it's partly because the impacts of a wide variety of things on student achievement are much stronger than the available revenues. However, there are a number of things that revenue limits do impact. College enrollment is strongly correlated with revenue limits. And Dr. Rothstein did a little bit of a case study for us about student achievement and spending, and identified that another $1,000 of revenues per student in St. Croix Falls, would cause their middle school report card scores to jump by 16 points, moving them from meeting few expectations to meeting expectations. So Dr. Rothstein's conclusions: revenue limits are persistent, they're closely tied to spending, and loosely tied to family income. There's no correlation or little correlation between revenue limits and forward scores because there are a lot of things that go into student achievement, and higher revenue limits are correlated with post-secondary enrollment in colleges. I interviewed Dr. Rothstein. You can see our discussion on AEF's YouTube channel, along with a variety of tips for efficiencies, investments, and cost savings. So in these next set of slides, I did some analysis of low revenue districts and high revenue districts. The low revenue districts, again, those 125 school districts in the bottom in red on the map. And I defined high revenue districts as those 125 school districts with a low revenue ceiling of about $11,000 or more. These data come from the 2021-2022 school district. First of all, we looked at the ratio of students to teachers. You have more kids per teacher in low revenue school districts. They can't afford as many teachers. In the districts with 10 students per teacher or less, i.e. those school districts with the best ratios, low revenue districts are just 8.8% of the total, but high revenue districts are almost 1 in 5. Students in low revenue districts share their teachers with more students. When you look at the school districts that have the highest ratios, you're much more likely to see low revenue districts in those schools that have a lot more kids per teacher. When you look at spending on elementary teachers, we spend about $2,600 per student in low revenue districts, but over $3,200 per student in high revenue districts. And of those school districts that spend up spend the very lowest amounts, low revenue school districts are much more likely to be in that group. Of the districts that spend at the highest levels, high revenue districts appear much more commonly in those groups, in that group, I should say. If you look at spending on middle and high school teachers, the average spend is $2,400 at in low revenue districts and almost $3,000 in high revenue districts. And again, of the districts that spend at the lowest level, low revenue districts appear much more commonly, 3 times as common as high revenue districts. And then if you look at the district spending more than $3,000 per student, low revenue districts make up just 17% of the total. So students in low revenue districts are much less likely to have the best student teacher ratios and much more likely to be in districts that are spending a lot less on their education. Part of the state's Vincent versus Voigt Supreme Court decision examining school funding said that if districts can meet the 20 school district standards, there was no constitutional problem. We did some analysis to look at some spending in 3 critical areas that are specifically listed in those 20 standards: guidance and counseling services, emergency nursing, and library media specialists. Not surprisingly, we found that revenue limits are highly correlated to student to counselor ratio. A lot more kids per counselor in low revenue districts, and low revenue districts spend quite a bit less on counseling services. We did an odds analysis looking at high revenue and low revenue districts. Low revenue schools are much less likely to have students in the low ratio area. School nurses. Revenue limits are strongly correlated with spending on school nurses. Low revenue districts spend an average of $78 per student. High revenue districts spend closer to $100 per student. If you look at those districts that spend $150 or more for every student, 22 of them are high revenue districts, just 7 of them are low revenue districts. We don't think that meets the state standard. We don't think it's fair. We don't think it's constitutional. If you look at library media specialists, these are those people who get kids involved in literacy, who get them the best research for their term papers, help them to reach college readiness. Districts with less than 500 students per library media specialist have an average revenue limit of $10,800. Districts with a lot more kids per media specialist have an average revenue limit that is much lower. So the most favorable staffing ratios exist in districts with significantly higher revenue limits. The top districts spend an average of $250 per student, and in the lowest districts, spending is just $74 per student. Kids in high revenue districts have a much better opportunity to work with a skilled library media specialist. So in summary, low revenue districts spend a lot less on elementary teachers, have more kids per class. They make up just 17% of districts that spend quite a bit more per middle school and high school student. They spend less on counselors. They spend less on nursing. They spend less on library media specialists. In conclusion on that section, our school funding system hurts kids in low revenue districts, and a few school districts have much more money per student than others. It's simply not fair. Well, there are some proposals out there to remedy this system, but unfortunately they haven't come out yet with very much alignment with this problem. The School Administrator Alliance is in support of DPI's proposal for giving $1,000 more in revenue limit to all school districts. That doesn't close the gaps at all. Governor Evers adds $1,000 for all districts, but $1,200 at the bottom. We say that makes some improvement, but we need substantial revenue limit gap closure. Here's a depiction of the DPI proposal. You can remember still have 125 school districts at the bottom, and those gaps are really substantial. In fact, at the top, 20 school districts get $116 million to educate about 4,000 students. It's an absurd amount of money at the top. The Evers revenue limit proposal doesn't close the gap very much. Instead of 125 districts at the bottom, he goes to 187 districts at the bottom. In contrast, here's the AEF proposal: a better distribution of state revenues. 354 districts at the bottom, and that is really at the bottom. That's almost everybody. There's only 421 school districts in the state. This would be a substantial bit of progress towards fairness and towards equity. Here's a comparison of those proposals. Remember, 125 school districts at the bottom right now. DPI's proposal would keep that at 125. The governor would go to 187. We would be at 354. And if you look at 10% of that minimum amount and what districts would fall within 10%, our proposal would take it to 93% of districts falling within 10% of each other. It's just fundamentally more fair. Our timeline is by July 1st, the new state budget will be in place. Then it will be up to AEF members to decide what comes next. If there's an improvement in state funding, are we content? Is it enough? Can AEF close our doors? If there's no improvement, is it time to pursue other options? Is it time for us to go back to court? We've prepared a set of legislator handouts for AEF members, and I'm going to switch over to the one for AEF members. 1 second here. I'm going to look at the one we've prepared for Representative Kitchens. Hopefully you're seeing this. A little bit of background that we've talked about, every state budget since 1993, all of those impacts with regard to student experiences, and then we get to some local examples. Here's Algoma, who's in that district, is in Representative Kitchens' legislative district. Again, they're stuck at $10,000. They're a low revenue district and an AEF member. In just that 1 year of 2021-22, they had a budget deficit of $617,000 due to the fact that they could not raise revenues at the same level as the average district around the state. If you look at that budget deficit and the deficit compared to average, and you bring that all from 30 years of deficits and add them all up, that's $12 million that Algoma does not have to dedicate to the education of their student because of other districts around them that and around the state that are getting substantially more money. And you can see there are some districts here that are getting really hammered on their revenue limit and the 30-year deficit. Nevertheless, in that area, here's Sevastopol School District getting over $11,000 and Gibraltar getting over $21,000. Gibraltar being that district right up at the end of Door County. So what's interesting is that AEF is not proposing to take money away from those few districts at the top. Instead, Joint Finance Committee 4 years ago brought the revenue limit up from the bottom, and we hope that that's what they do again. DPI wants to raise all those revenues by $1,000. That doesn't close gaps. Governor Evers adds another couple $100. That has a small impact. AEF is proposing to raise those revenue limits by $1,500 per student. So in summary, this is our moment. Here's what you can do. First of all, go to the AEF website and download the legislator handout for key lawmakers in your area and use that handout to make other people aware of these issues. Make copies, give them to friends, pass them out at school or community events. Send a copy of the handout to your legislator and ask for improvement. They need to know that this is an issue for people all around the state. AEF is going to be sending out a resolution about revenue limits to school boards. get that done. Get that school board to endorse that resolution, send it to your local newspaper, send it to state elected officials, and finally testify at the joint finance hearings in your area. Well, I want to thank you for paying attention to AEF and to these revenue limits that have been in place for 30 years. They're fundamentally unfair, unconstitutional. They hurt kids, and the solution is in our hands. The state now has a $7 billion budget excess, available funds to close revenue limit gaps. We call on legislators all across the state to do exactly that, just like they did 4 years ago. That level of effort would once again go a great distance towards closing the revenue limit gaps. Thank you so much for your interest. Feel free to reach out to AEF. We're always happy to share more information about revenue limits and how they impact students and what we can be doing about them. Thanks again.